Human confusion does not begin with mistakes. It begins at the moment we stop thinking for ourselves. That sentence, when it first echoed in my mind, felt like a thin crack on glass, not large enough to frighten me right away, but enough to know it would spread if I kept touching it. I remember that moment, a slow afternoon. The wind caught in the dry branches outside the window, and it felt as if the world was whispering something we had missed for far too long. Maybe that is why I asked myself how much of what is inside us truly belongs to us, and how much is only an echo from the crowd that we never noticed. That question floated in the air like the dust visible in sunlight, not heavy, not loud, but lingering for a long time. I once believed that every person carried a small light inside their mind, enough to guide them away from the noise. But the more I looked, the more I saw that this light does not fade because of darkness, but because they try to make it look like the light of the one standing next to them. The crowd has a strange kind of pull. It makes us believe that agreement is proof of truth, that similarity is evidence of what is right. When a few dozen people nod, an idea can turn into an unwritten rule. We lean on it the way we lean on a stair rail, forgetting that sometimes the stairs do not lead to where we want to go. There is something very human in that need, the need not to be left behind, as if loneliness were a mistake rather than a state of being. I remember an old story about a classroom where the teacher asked a simple question and most students answered incorrectly. Only a few children knew the right answer, but when they looked around and saw the confidence of the majority, they stayed silent, or worse, forced themselves to say what was wrong. No one threatened them, no one pushed them, but the fear of being seen as different was stronger than any warning. When I read that, I realized those children were not much different from adults. They had only not yet learned how to justify their own fear. As grown-ups, we replace that silence with reasons that sound more reasonable, but the essence stays the same. We choose to belong to the crowd instead of belonging to the truth. It is strange to think that what breaks us is not a convincing argument, but the gaze of those around us. One moment of hesitation, one skipped heartbeat, and we drift in a direction we never meant to follow. Once, I stood in a conference hall watching hundreds of people agree with an idea I knew was wrong. I felt an undertow in the room, cold, thick, and strong, trying to pull me along. Only one person stood up to say what was right, but his voice felt as lonely as a small boat cutting through waves in the night. I asked myself if I, in his place, would have enough courage to speak differently. We often think that reason is firm, like a stone unshaken by the wind, but if we look closely, we see how fragile it really is. It is held up by invisible conditions, a sense of safety, privacy, space to think. Place that reason in a moving crowd and it trembles like a tight rope pulled from both ends. People do not step away from reason because they are foolish, but because they are afraid. Afraid of being isolated, afraid of being mocked, afraid of the emptiness when no one stands with them. That fear, once it spreads across enough people, becomes a system that sustains itself. No one forces anyone, yet everyone forces themselves. Schopenhauer once said that most people do not live by reason, but by the instinct to avoid pensée. I think of that sentence whenever I watch a crowd move in one direction like a flock of migrating birds with none of them truly knowing why they must go. That thought makes me both sad and tender, like watching someone exhausted still trying to keep pace just so they will not fall behind. When living in society, we forget that some paths can only be walked alone, and it is exactly in that solitude that we hear our own voice. The irony is that in trying to keep a sense of belonging, we lose the most important thing, the ability to know what we are really thinking. I'm not trying to paint a bleak picture. People still have moments of clarity, moments when they look directly at the truth, even when it cuts like a blade. But those moments are rarer than we assume. Most of the time we are repeating what we hear from others as if their voices have echoed in us long enough for us to mistake them as our own. The danger does not lie in being wrong, but in not knowing what inside us is real, in not knowing whether we are standing on solid ground or on the shadow of those around us. And then another thought touched me, light but deep. Maybe what distorts the world is not lies, but our lack of patience for the truth. Truth rarely arrives all at once. It asks us to stand still for a moment, to accept the loneliness of being different. But the crowd does not have that patience. They need answers now, agreement now, something to reassure them that they are moving in the right direction. So they choose the loudest voice, not the truest one. They choose the crowded path, not the reasonable one. The most frightening part is that we have grown so used to this that we no longer notice it happening, like living near train tracks long enough to forget the shock that the sound once gave us when we first moved in. Familiarity numbs us, and then one day we find ourselves carrying beliefs with no idea where they came from. Emotions we do not know who planted, fears that somehow became part of our body. At that moment, the question is no longer what we think, but who has been thinking for us. Maybe that is why to begin seeing again we need a moment of true pause, a moment when we step back from the crowd just once and listen to whatever sound remains inside us. It may be faint, it may tremble, but it is the only sound that can guide us toward the truth. I believe every deep change begins in that quiet. A small room, a warm lamp, a long breath, and a question appearing, simple yet impossible to escape. What inside us is real, and what is only the echo of others. There are moments in the middle of an ordinary day when we realize that the desire to belong to a group was planted in us very early, like an instinct sleeping under the skin. No one teaches us to fear loneliness, yet every early experience whispers that standing alone is something out of rhythm. Children in the schoolyard learn to look into one another's eyes to find approval. The sudden laughter, the synchronized comments, the automatic nods, all create the feeling that safety does not lie in truth but in walking in the same direction as the majority. When we grow up, we simply replace the schoolyard with an office, replace glances with polite conversations. But that deep mechanism remains unchanged. We want to be accepted before we want to be understood. The strange thing is that in the moment we blend into the crowd, we lose the very thing that makes us human, the ability to question ourselves. Thoughts in the mind, soft and fragile like a thin thread, are easily torn apart when we hear 100 people speaking in the same direction. We do not become wrong right away, but we grow hesitant with our own truth, like someone hiding a fresh wound under a sleeve, not wanting others to see, under the gaze of the collective. Silence becomes a shelter, and people often choose that shelter even when it is cold, cramped, and airless. Compromise begins with small things, an opinion left unsaid, a light objection swallowed back, a doubt that never becomes words. And then it grows until we no longer remember what our real voice once sounded like. I once saw this in a long meeting where everyone nodded at an idea that had been outdated for years. Their eyes moved across one another as if seeking reassurance that they were not alone in believing something wrong. I watched a man sitting nearby, his fingers lightly tapping the table, a small rhythm revealing his hesitation. But when the whole room leaned toward a shared conclusion, that hand fell still. He pulled himself inward as if his body wanted to fade to match the space. In that moment, I understood that sometimes we do not choose what is wrong because we believe in it, but because we fear becoming the only one who speaks differently. The root of that fear is not weakness, but an ancient memory inside the human body. Long ago, being separated from the tribe meant death. So our body learned to fear unfamiliar gazes, learned to tremble when many people opposed us. Even though society has changed, the trace remains like a thin current running through the spine. When someone stands before a crowd to speak a different truth, the tremble in their voice comes not only from present worry, but from thousands of years written into their body. Humans can use reason to build cities, but they cannot erase the marks of instinct in their chest. Schopenhauer understood this in his own way when he said that most people act not from thought, but from invisible forces pushing from within. Those forces make them merge with the crowd like a drop of water falling into a river, losing its shape the moment it touches the surface. When we stand in a crowd, we do not only hear the voices of others, but also hear the echo of our own fear, the fear that convinces us that silence is the safest choice. But the irony is that the safety the crowd offers is only a thin blanket over a cold room. It does not warm us. It only numbs us so we no longer feel the cold. I once met a woman who lived her whole life in agreement, doing what was expected, saying just enough not to draw attention, avoiding conflict the way one avoids an unhealed wound. One day she told me she no longer knew who she was. Her words startled me, not because they were tragic, but because they were familiar. Losing oneself does not happen in a sharp moment. It happens quietly like water seeping through soil, creating a hollow that only reveals itself when the ground collapses. And in many cases, That hollow begins when we stop trusting the small voice inside us because it feels too out of tune with the majority. But do we truly want to hear that voice? That is the hardest question, because once we listen, we must face the possibility that we have been wrong, or worse, that our entire life has been built on things that do not belong to us. People fear truth not because it is complex, but because it demands responsibility. The agreement of the crowd is different. It is soft, easy to swallow, easy to justify. We only need to say that everyone is like that, and then we no longer have to take responsibility for our choices. In truth, deep down, everyone has moments when they realize they are walking a path that is not theirs. It might happen when we stand before the mirror in the morning, looking into our own eyes and seeing they no longer shine the way they once did, or when we sit alone in a dark room, realizing the exhaustion does not come from work but from constantly playing someone else. These moments are like a gentle knock on the door, reminding us that something is waiting to be faced. The truth is that the crowd does not love us the way we think. They only love how similar we are to them. The moment we change even slightly, that warmth disappears like breath in cold air. That is not cruelty. It is simply the nature of a collective. Their strength lies in shared movement, not in difference. So when we try to keep ourselves inside that circle by shrinking who we are, we trade away the most precious thing, the ability to see the world clearly through our own eyes. But if we stop long enough, we will see something Schopenhauer quietly pointed out. Reason never dies. It is only covered. It waits for a crack of light. It waits for a moment of silence when the footsteps of the crowd fade and we are no longer pulled into their rhythm. That moment does not come from luck. It comes from the gentle courage of one who dares to ask whether this truly belongs to them. And perhaps in that moment, a person begins to touch their first sense of freedom. There are beliefs that, when repeated long enough, begin to resemble laws even though they have no foundation beyond the convenience of the majority. People, when standing together, often choose what makes them less uneasy rather than what makes them clear-sighted. Collective agreement, when viewed from afar, looks like a calm lake. But up close we see it is formed from countless fears frozen into place. Schopenhauer once suggested that what gains wide acceptance is rarely the truth, but only the masks the crowd wears to avoid looking into the darkness within themselves. And I understood this more clearly when I watched how people cling to the familiar as if it were a lifeline, even though it quietly pulls them deeper into layers of illusion. I remember a winter evening, reading old notes in a room lit only by a desk lamp. Schopenhauer's words felt like footsteps passing down a hallway, quiet enough not to startle, yet clear enough to make me look up. He wrote that people rarely seek the truth, they only seek reassurance. That struck me in a way difficult to describe because I realized that I too had, more than once, chosen the comfort of the majority instead of facing the rough edges of truth. All of us have moments when we run from what we know is right simply because we do not want to be the only one who stands differently. In that moment, truth suddenly becomes too heavy to carry alone. And then as I found myself in groups of people, everything became clearer. The human mind does not need to be forced to abandon its reason. It willingly does so when it sees that no one around dares to speak differently. A room full of agreement can turn a wrong idea into a right one, at least in the eyes of those trembling for a sense of belonging. The greatest pressure does not come from others, but from the loneliness of having to hold on to our own thoughts. That is why many people choose to let them go, like dropping a small object in exchange for a greater sense of safety. As these beliefs are passed from one person to another, they become like old coins worn by time, yet still circulating because no one thinks to examine their real value. Perhaps the most frightening thing is not that we believe something false, but that we no longer know where our beliefs come from. Do they rise from our own experiences or from the noise of the surrounding world? When that question appears, we often turn away quickly as if afraid that digging deeper will reveal unsteady ground beneath our feet. There are also moments when we realize that truth and safety cannot walk side by side. Truth is often lonely, not attractive, not loud. It has none of the pull of a slogan or the shine of a movement. It stands quietly in a corner, waiting for the patient to approach, and not many do. This is not because they lack intelligence, but because they have learned to equate agreement with correctness. A small confusion, yet its consequences reach into the way we live, love, and choose. If you're hearing these words and feel somewhere inside you a patch of unsteady ground, I want to say that this feeling is normal. Sometimes truth does not arrive as a beam of light, but as a small inconvenience in the mind, forcing us to pause. And sometimes sharing that thought helps us see it more clearly. If you have ever found yourself following the crowd against your will, or staying silent before something you believed was wrong, leave a few lines in the comments. I read them not to gather opinions, but to know that each of us, in our own way, is trying to find a voice that belongs to ourselves. And if these conversations bring a little brightness to you, stay with us by subscribing so we do not lose each other in the noise. I once met a young man who always appeared calm about everything. He said he believed in what was widely accepted because it felt safer. But when I asked whether he had ever examined those things for himself, he stayed silent for a long time. He admitted that he had not dared to. He feared that if he looked too deeply, he would have to walk away from the relationships he relied on. I understood that fear. Many people mistake questioning for betrayal, but in truth, the fact that we dare to ask only proves that we still want a life not shaped entirely by others. There are questions that seem to make life more complicated but in fact open a new path. For example, if everyone around us suddenly changed their view, would we still hold on to what we believe is right? This question does not need an immediate answer. It only needs to be kept there, quiet like a cold breeze touching the back of the neck. Because sometimes simply facing the question means we have already stepped one pace out of the fog of the crowd. From a distance, we can see that most of what people call belief is only a copy of a copy. Thoughts passed from one person to another, fading, blurring, yet kept because of the comfort of familiarity. Few ask whether they were born from truth or from habit, and in that passivity, reason is not destroyed by force but worn away like stone eroded by dripping water through the years. The strange thing is that when we dare to step even slightly away from that current, we begin to hear other sounds, a small doubt, a quiet intuition, sometimes a feeling we cannot name. These signals are faint but honest. They are the remaining pieces of the self not yet flattened by the crowd. When we listen to them, even for a few seconds, we unintentionally break the power the crowd holds over us. And from those small moments, the journey out of the darkness of blind agreement begins to take shape. There is something few people want to admit. We do not think as much as we believe we do. Beneath decisions that appear reasonable is a quiet, stubborn, murky force, like an underground current always trying to flow toward the most familiar direction. Schopenhauer once called it the primal will, something that needs no reason to exist, only movement. When we observe a crowd, we see that this current is so strong that even the most intelligent people struggle to resist it. In such moments, reason becomes like a small flashlight in a strong wind. Its light does not go out, but it bends so much that it no longer illuminates the path clearly. I once saw that trembling light in the eyes of a middle-aged man at an event that held no real importance. A piece of false information was shared, and the room grew tight with immediate agreement. The man slightly parted his lips, ready to speak, but when he saw the rows of heads nodding together, his voice froze in his throat. I stood close enough to see his chest rise once, then still. The moment was not dramatic. There was no clear conflict, yet it sent a shiver through me. A human being had dropped his truth simply because he did not want to become the lone voice. That fall made no sound. It was as light as a sheet of paper dropping onto a carpet, yet it was enough to redirect the entire conversation. Years later, when I remembered it, I realized that reason is not defeated by great pressure, but by the silence of everyone else. When a room full of people believes they are thinking the same, none of them is truly thinking. They are only reflecting each other like fogged mirrors, blending until no one can tell which image is original, and in that blur, responsibility dissolves. No one feels responsible for the choice anymore, because the decision has become the will of an anonymous collective. That is when the worst things can happen, not because someone wanted them, but because no one dared to stop and look back. Stories about psychological experiments are only the surface of what I mean. They describe submission to authority. But the more frightening submission is to the general atmosphere of the room. When a group stands together, they can create a pressure field that makes any individual feel too weak to hold on to their own thoughts. It is like an invisible force that softens us. We do not like to admit this because it wounds our sense of self, but we have surrendered to it many times. I once spoke with a friend who believed he was independent and unaffected by others, but when he told me about his childhood, one detail stood out. He had never dared choose the toy he liked if all the other children chose something else. He laughed while telling it, but when I asked him why, he had no answer. It made me realize that the crowd does not only influence our present choices, it digs trenches around what we dare and do not dare to choose for our entire lives. Some limits we think are our own were actually placed there by others. Schopenhauer believed that the collective does not make people worse directly. It simply stops them from examining what is right. A person standing alone can hesitate, can reflect, can look inward. But standing in a large group, those vital pauses disappear. The crowd dislikes hesitation. They demand motion. Slowness confuses them, so they push everything to move faster, until there is no time for reason to form. The collective does not hate truth. They simply lack patience to find it. And what troubles me most is how fear spreads among people standing close to one another. Like a cold draft crawling across the skin. One person is afraid to speak their belief. The second sees this and learns silence. Then the third, the fourth. Soon the entire room falls quiet. Not because no one knows the truth, but because each believes they are the only one who sees it. That loneliness, that mistake of thinking one is the odd one out, is the crowd's greatest weapon. I have often wondered what would happen if one person, just one, stood up and said what they knew was right. The answer is not simple. They may be seen as troublesome, arrogant, or disruptive, but they might also become the hinge that pushes the door open. A well-timed truth has the power to crack the wall of false agreement. This is not romanticism. It is the nature of change. Most of society's great movements began not from the crowd, but from one person who refused to stay silent. But to become that person, one must face the darker side within, the part that seeks the smoothest path, the part that prefers blending in, the part that wants to live in the soft fog of familiarity. Facing this part is not easy because it has been fed for decades by the encouragement of the collective. Lessons about fitting in, about agreeing, about not causing trouble have woven an invisible net around us since childhood. To remove each strand of that net, we must be patient enough and honest enough to look at ourselves without turning away. When we begin to do that, we see another truth. Reason is not a flame waiting to be fanned. It is a small ember. It glows more quietly than we expect, yet it remains. As long as we do not smother it with fear, it can shine enough to illuminate the things we have long overlooked. Each time we dare to think differently, even in silence, that ember grows a little brighter, and one day, if we are patient enough, it may become a fire strong enough to guide us out of the heavy shadow of the crowd. Perhaps what we need is not a powerful call to action, but a moment of realization that we are living in a room we did not build. When we see that, the door is already slightly open, and the path leading outward, though faint, has already begun to appear. There is something that seems harmless yet quietly shapes an entire human life. We do not only borrow beliefs from the crowd, we borrow desires we mistake as our own. Happiness, which everyone calls their final goal, is sometimes an old object passed from hand to hand, shining not because of its nature but because so many have touched it. When we look around, we see people chasing money, fame, recognition as if those things carried a rare fragrance. But if we sit still for a moment, we see that fragrance does not belong to anyone. It rises from agreement, from seeing others run and believing we must run too. I once met a successful man, always perfectly composed as if every gesture had been polished 100 times. He said he was exhausted but did not know why. When I asked what he wanted most, he stayed silent for so long that I thought the question had slipped into a crack somewhere. Then he said something strange. I do not know what I want, but I know I must want what everyone else wants. A cold wind moved through my mind. It turned out there are people who spend their entire lives chasing goals, not because they long for them, but because they fear the loneliness of wanting something different from the majority. Collective happiness, if looked at closely, is like a light mist settling over the city in the early morning. It softens the scenery and makes it pleasant, but it also hides the real lines beneath. People believe that having money brings happiness, having fame brings happiness, being admired brings happiness. But they forget some things only shine when seen from afar. Once touched, they reveal themselves as cold and slippery, like stones that have sat too long under a riverbed. Yet we keep trying to grasp them because the fear of letting go is stronger than the discomfort of wanting something that never satisfies. One afternoon, I walked past a cafe where young people were talking about their dreams. What caught my attention was not any dream that was bold or surprising, but the fact that all of them sounded strangely alike, as if they were using the same template to sketch their lives. I do not think they intended it. They simply carried a belief that success must take a certain shape and happiness comes only when they reach that shape. No one asked whether they themselves fit that mold. They only feared being seen as someone without ambition, even when that ambition was not theirs. The danger is that the crowd does not need to force us to flow. They only need to let us see that they are running. And suddenly we feel that if we do not run, we will remain still forever. We do not want to be left behind. Do not want to be the only one who does not understand what everyone else seems to understand. The invisibility of that fear allows it to slip into every fold of our lives, into the career choices we push ourselves into, the relationships we force ourselves to maintain, the things we buy only to feel like we are keeping up. Each decision becomes a layer of dust settling on an old table, and one day we realize we can no longer see the original wood beneath. Schopenhauer once said that people live in layers of illusion to make breathing easier, and perhaps he was right. The truth about ourselves is sometimes too sharp, too bare, too imperfect. The illusions of happiness created by the crowd are like soft curtains that hide the dark corners we do not want to face, but the price we pay is that we no longer see our own path clearly. We walk inside someone else's room, under the light someone else chose, holding objects others decided were beautiful. We lose the most important thing, the right to define happiness in our own way. I once met a young woman who said she always felt as if she were chasing someone, though she didn't know who. The feeling was like running on a long road where the figure ahead grows farther the more she runs. When I asked what she wanted, she gave a sad smile. She said she did not know because before she had time to want anything, she had already been taught there were certain things she must want. The confusion between true desire and borrowed desire kept her from standing still without feeling like a failure. In her eyes, I saw the exhaustion carried by so many people, an exhaustion born from a race they never chose to enter. In the quieter moments of life, we can feel that emptiness more clearly, when we have everything the crowd says we need, yet our hearts feel as hollow as an unfurnished room. That hollowness is not an accusation, it is an invitation. It invites us to stop, set down the borrowed things, and ask ourselves when was the last time we truly wanted something. A desire not shaped by someone else's gaze, not fed by competition, not wrapped in applause. A desire that rises from within, even if it is small, vague, and unfinished. Some people say that to find true happiness, we must leave the crowd. But I do not think that is entirely true. We cannot separate ourselves from the world. Humans are made to live among others. The problem is not leaving. The problem is awakening. We must know when the crowd is pouring into us desires that are not ours. We must notice when running is only fear of being left behind. We must step back enough to look behind the things we are chasing. And sometimes, with just one step back, the horizon changes completely. There are things we call morality simply because so many people believe in them, like old stones laid across a road, kept not because they are useful but because people have stepped on them for too long. When we look at history, we easily see how norms once celebrated later became stains of their era. But what chills me is not the brutality of the past. It is how easily people accepted those things simply because everyone else did. Morality, when carried through the hands of the crowd, becomes a fogged mirror. Everyone looks into it, yet no one sees their true face. I once spoke with an old man who had lived through a time when absurdity was praised as obvious truth. He said what haunted him was not the wrongness itself, but the comfort people felt while believing it. That comfort was like a thick blanket wrapped around an entire community, dulling their sense of the coldness of what they supported. Hearing him, I understood that morality does not collapse because of evil, but because of spiritual laziness. People want norms that are easy to swallow, easy to apply, norms that do not require them to confront their own dark corners. In modern life, this blurring is more subtle. People no longer hang harsh slogans on the streets. Instead, morality is shaped by trends, by waves of opinion that sweep across like wind passing through fields. A viewpoint becomes right not because it has depth, but because it is shared so often that anyone who questions it is seen as dangerous. I once saw a friend harshly criticized simply for asking a normal question. He did not argue, he only asked. But to the crowd, a question itself can be a threat. They want a flat world, easy to grasp, where everything is already defined. A question is a crack in the wall, and they despise cracks. That hostility does not come only from ignorance, but from fear. Because if one person dares to question, the others must face questions of their own, and not everyone has the courage to confront what they once believed. So they protect old beliefs like keepsakes even when those beliefs have lost all meaning. The crowd does not fear being wrong, they fear having to begin again. One evening I stood in a train station watching a group argue about something trivial. Strangely, everyone agreed with the first viewpoint offered, though it was shallow and unfounded. A young woman beside me whispered that she disagreed but would not speak up. When I asked why, she said it would make everyone uncomfortable. I did not respond, but a clear thought rose in me. The morality of the crowd is often just the art of not causing discomfort, an art easy to learn yet dangerous if used as the foundation for life. This blending brings another cost. People lose the ability to see one another as independent individuals. The crowd does not see humans. It sees roles. It does not see someone's private sorrow. It sees only their position in the system. It does not hear the tremble in the voice of someone trying to tell the truth. It hears only discord. Everything becomes sorted into groups, us and them, right and wrong, inside and outside. These divisions are woven from fear but wrapped in words that sound moral. A person is considered wrong, not because their reasoning is poor, but because the crowd is unfamiliar with their existence. Another is praised not because they are wise, but because they repeat what comforts the crowd. Human nature becomes hidden beneath fragile labels, and in that concealment, compassion weakens, like a lamp left unclean for too long. I once witnessed a moment that stayed with me for years. A young man was treated cruelly in a group simply because he behaved differently. No one truly wanted to hurt him, but in the atmosphere of the collective, coldness became an unconscious habit. One person repeated a mocking remark, then another laughed, and soon the whole group treated it as normal. When I looked at his face, I saw loneliness not of one person but of all who had ever been turned into entertainment by a crowd desperate to preserve its fragile unity. What haunts me is that none of them were truly cruel. They only borrowed one another's hands to do what none of them would have dared alone. Fear of being singled out made them willing to blur the line between what was right and what was merely accepted. Their morality did not shatter. It thinned until it was unrecognizable. And then, in the rare quiet moments when the crowd dissolved, I could see them awkwardly touching the remnants of their own humanity. A small regret, a brief bowed head, a quick averted gaze, all of it like signals showing that compassion had not disappeared. It had only been buried under the dust of collective reflexes. If people dared stay longer in that moment, they might see something important. Compassion grows only when we see others as individuals, not as representatives of a group. That is what the crowd, with all its power and allure, always obscures. And when we finally understand this, we realize that to live a life not swept away, we must relearn how to see before we relearn how to think. There are nights when the city sinks into its layers of darkness and the noise fades into a thin mist around the ears. And in that quiet, we can finally hear what daylight hides, the exhaustion within ourselves. Not the tiredness from work or the small collisions of life, but the fatigue of carrying too many expectations that do not belong to us. In the dark, we can see more clearly the small hollow where our sense of self once stood, now worn down by countless borrowed voices, and when we walk toward that hollow, we understand that to reclaim what was lost, we do not need to defeat the crowd, we only need to face ourselves, the part that has been silent for far too long. I once sat by a window watching dry trees tremble under the pale yellow streetlight and realized something strange. The truth inside us never shouts. It does not seek power. It does not crave approval. It does not ask us to speak loudly. It simply waits there, quiet as the shadow of someone sitting at the end of a train car, waiting for us to be calm enough to approach. That made me think of the years I spent blending into the crowd. Years I mistook for growth when I was only learning to hide my own voice. And solitude, the thing we fear so often, is actually the only place where that voice has enough room to rise. But that solitude is not the wall of separation we imagine. It is more like an open field where we can walk without fearing we might collide with someone else, where the ground is soft enough for us to hear our own footsteps. In this stepping away, there is no arrogance of someone who wants to stand above others, only the honesty of one who wants to know where they are going. And once we understand that, solitude becomes the purest form of freedom. Freedom from noise, from comparison, from the endless duty of performing a role built from expectations. This freedom does not make us grand. It returns us to the true size of our own humanity. I once met a man who had spent his life among applause. He said people loved him, yet none truly saw him. When the applause stopped, the only thing that remained was an empty echo in his chest. He said it was the first time he understood what loneliness meant, but also the first time he felt he was truly alive, with no one left to please, no one to win over. He had to face himself without a mask. And in that moment he realized that compassion, which he thought had died in the noise of his life, was still there, only buried under too many cheers. Compassion, as Schopenhauer once hinted with a restrained voice, is not born from the collective. It rises in private moments when we see someone else's pain as a small reflection of our own. The crowd cannot do this. The crowd sees people as symbols, as groups, as sides. Only when we step away from them does the distance allow us to see the true lines of a face, no longer hidden by shared judgment. In that stepping away, we do not only keep our reason alive, we restore the ability to see others with human eyes. One afternoon, I walked through a park and saw a boy trying to fix a broken kite. People passed by him, not because they lacked kindness, but because they saw him as part of the scenery. I stopped not because I was better, but because I was in a state of separation from the hurry of the crowd. That moment made me understand more clearly than ever. When we slow down, we begin to see what the crowd never notices. Compassion does not grow from greatness. It grows from slowing down at the right time. Just as questioning our beliefs opens the door to clarity, this slowing down opens the door to freedom. A freedom not bright or showy, but steady and deep like a quiet heartbeat. In that freedom we can test our voice again, feeling our way toward words that truly belong to us. We can look back at our fear of being left behind and realize it is smaller than we thought. What makes us tremble is not the truth but the imagined idea of isolation. But the truth is that when we dare to step out of line, we do not lose the world. We only lose things that were never ours. The most beautiful thing that separation from the crowd brings is not intellectual independence, but the opening of compassion. In the quiet, we begin to see people not as representatives of positions or groups, but as themselves. We see them in their exhaustion, in their hidden sadness, in the mistakes they made which we too once made. And when we see them that way, we no longer want to defeat them, no longer want to correct them with the tone of someone trying to win. We simply want to understand them, because in them we recognize a smaller version of ourselves. Perhaps this is what surprises many people. When we escape the shadow of the crowd, what we find is not absolute isolation, but another form of connection. One built not on the fear of being left out, but on a quiet acknowledgement of the shared pain of being human. In that acknowledgement we find what Schopenhauer called the only foundation of morality, compassion. And it is compassion, not intellect, that brings us closest to real freedom. That freedom is not a proud stride down a wide road, but a slow walk on a narrow path where we can hear our own steps. No applause, no nods, but also no one pulling us in another direction. In that stillness we choose our own life, not the life the crowd drew for us. And perhaps only then do we dare ask one final question, soft but powerful enough to shake what once felt certain. Do we want to become a voice, or only the echo left behind from someone else? When the story closes, the world does not change all at once. The streetlights still tremble in the thin wind. The passing faces still carry stories we cannot guess. And somewhere in the city, someone is still trying to blend into the crowd to feel a little less lost. But if we listen more closely, very closely, we will sense something shifting, as lightly as the earth breathing after the first rain of the season. A small movement, yet enough for us to know that inside, Something has just been rearranged. There are moments in a life that come only once, like the moment a door opens slightly. It does not creak. It does not shine. It simply moves a little, as if making a suggestion. If we catch it in time, we will see an entire path behind it, long, quiet, and waiting. That path is not reserved for the brave or the solitary. It is for anyone who wants to live a life not led by noise, a life where each step belongs to us, not borrowed from the rhythm of others. Sometimes all we need is one deep breath, one brief pause to realize that the fear of being separated from the crowd is not as great as the fear of losing ourselves. And perhaps in that pause, we will notice another face beside us. Someone also trying to hear their own voice, also searching for a way out of the dim fog of shared expectations. That meeting, even in silence, is proof that people are never truly alone when they begin the journey of being honest with themselves. We may blend into the flow of people again tomorrow morning, facing glances, choices, and ways of living we do not always understand. But once we have heard our inner voice, even once, it will not disappear. It will stay, like light breaking through a narrow crack in a door, catching the dust in the air and reminding us that some truths appear only when we move slowly enough to see them. And one day, at some quiet crossroads with no signs, remember that what matters is not which direction we choose, but that we choose it with our own mind. That freedom, fragile as it may be, is the gift we give ourselves after stepping out of the shadow of the crowd. And when night slows down again and the world rests in its soft darkness, maybe we will whisper something small, as if to ourselves. I'm still here. I've not faded into someone else's echo. I'm still a voice, faint perhaps, trembling perhaps, but my own. And sometimes that alone is enough to begin a new life.
Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. If this message touched your heart, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss the next journey we take together. Your support means the world to me.